Let's look at the tortuous path towards independence that is undertaken by our countries. You remember that the First World War led to the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, and its territories were now up for grabs for the victorious powers of this war. But if you might recall, there's now this somewhat insidious idea of self-determination that had sprang up in the period before the First World War and was now openly endorsed by President Wilson of the United States of America. So just open annexation was no longer deemed to be acceptable in the context of the post-war settlement. So at the same time, the victorious powers were not willing to renounce their territorial interests. So the arrangement found was the so-called mandate system laid down in the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular the League of Nations Covenant. And it sought to address this practical problem of how to acquire the territories without breaking or formally renouncing the idea of self-determination. So the mandate system laid down in Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant was based on the idea that some countries were not able yet to administer themselves, so they had to be placed under the tutelage of a more mature, read European power, until such time as they had acquired the maturity to stand on their own feet. Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant seemed appropriate in the context, but now in hindsight, it's probably one of the most offensive articles in that legal document. It begins like this: to those colonies and territories which, as a consequence of the late war, have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. The best method of giving practical effect to this principle is that the tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who, by reason of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position, can best undertake this responsibility and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League. If you were sitting now in one of the classes I teach on public international law, we would spend more time on this article and the mandate system that sprang from it under the League of Nations, and the trusteeship system, as it was then called when the United Nations took over the assets of the League after World War II. But already here, maybe I can ask you, do you find the idea embodied in this article to be something that's acceptable in the way we nowadays conduct our business? Do you find it offensive? And if so, why? I think part of the answer why we today would find it offensive, and let's not forget it was considered to be offensive already at the time by the people concerned, is the idea of civilization and gradations of civilization, of some people being less civilized than some others. And let's not forget, we're not talking about developmental stages in the administrative capacity of states only. It is the explicit notion of civilization. That is one part why we consider it to be offensive. But perhaps more important why we consider it to be offensive is because the so-called sacred trust of civilization that is now referred to in this article is not given to some disinterested, neutral Switzerland of this world. No, it is given to the very colonial powers that have conducted these extremely offensive, repressive colonial exploitations as we discussed in the last video, for example, in Algeria. These very powers are now entrusted with somehow being able to disinterestedly administer colonial peoples and territories on behalf of the League and for the interest of these people. And it's, to use a maybe stark comparison, it's literally making putting the fox in charge of the chicken house. And that's exactly how the mandatory powers acted. And perhaps, the longest serving and one of the most offensive ways the mandatory system was exploited is, for example, by South Africa and Namibia. Let's leave it at this point. What's important for us to, in our context, is that most of the Arab nations that were subject to the control of the losing sides of World War I, i.e. today Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Libya, were placed in the so-called A-type, A-class of mandates. What do you now going to think, what is an A-type mandate? Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant distinguished between three types of colonial areas. Those that were quite close, almost ready to stand on their own feet, i.e. the A-class mandates that were supposed to have only a relatively short period of transition. Then those that were further removed from civilization, the so-called B-class mandates, and those that were very remote, very sparsely populated, and very uncivilized, and therefore would require a very long period of administration by the mandatory power. These are the so-called C-class territories, mandates. So the Arab nations that now fall under the mandate system are all placed in the A-class. So they are fairly ready for independence. Now, let's not forget, these are only the territories belonging to the losers of World War I. The victors of World War I, they continue to maintain and exploit their colonial possessions. With respect to Egypt, the monarchy that the British are now that they continue and that they now formally release into independence, obviously, as we discussed already, does not enjoy a very large degree of legitimacy and also effectiveness. It is, for all intents and purposes, Egypt continues to be a colonial possession of Britain. And that's obviously something that certain sections of the Egyptian society, and particularly the Egyptian army, do not find very appealing, which leads then in 1953 to a coup d'etat that deposes the king. And here we see a picture of the so-called free Egyptian officers that staged this coup against the king and deplace him. The coup was initially staged under the leadership of Mohammed Najib, but very quickly a young officer, Jamal Abdel Nasser, becomes the charismatic leader of this new political force. But it's now important to compare, if you look at what we discussed when we talked about modern Turkey, unlike the Turkish officers that emerged from World War I with a very strong legitimacy as military commanders based on the exploits on the battlefield. And again, remember both Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his fellow officers, they had a very clear strategic vision of where they wanted to lead Turkey. That strategic vision is absent in the free Egyptian officers. They have some vague notions of pan-Arabism, of Egyptian role in the world, but there is no clear, or not as clear as in the Turkish case, no clear vision of how they want to lead the transformation of the Egyptian state and society. What helps turn Jamal Abdel Nasser into a popular hero is the nationalization of the Suez Canal. looking a little bit ahead of our course, looking at Iran that we will talk about in 2 weeks. In 1950, the Iranian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, whom you see here on this picture, nationalized the British-held oil interests in Iran. And that was, as you can imagine, a highly controversial, strongly resisted move by the Western powers, but extremely enthusiastically welcomed throughout the Muslim and the rest of the developing world. So what this president set in motion in Egypt was that the Suez Canal, that played a similarly important role in the economy of Egypt, and that continued to be held by French and British, mainly private investors. So just as the Iranian Prime Minister had done in nationalizing the British oil interests, there are now calls in Egypt and actually elsewhere in the developing world to nationalize colonially held economic interests for the benefit of popular development, economic development. So there are now calls in Egypt for a greater share in the revenues generated by the Suez Canal, leading eventually in 1956 to the nationalization of the Suez Canal.
From Alexandria, Egypt, Movietone News brings you the latest incident to upset the chancelleries of the free world. President Nasser delivering his fiery speech telling of his nationalization of the Suez Canal. A seizure from private interests that the Egyptian says is his answer to the West for refusing to finance the Aswan Dam. It's a situation fraught with implications. But undeterred, President Nasser raises his country's flag to symbolize his action. And although his followers hail him and carry him triumphantly on their shoulders, in London, Paris, and Washington, the fate of the strategic waterway causes grave concern.
What is perhaps quaint looking is the tone of indignation in that newsreel, as you see, that obviously it's a Western newsreel, and the indignation clearly felt and expressed that what are these brown people thinking of taking away our canal that we built and that we own. It's a very similar sentence that was expressed towards what are these Iranians thinking about taking our oil away. It comes across in this newsreel quite well, I think. So what now happens after the Egyptians nationalized the Suez Canal, what do you think is the reaction of France and Britain? What do you think? How are they going to react? Will they simply sit back and accept it? What would you do? Well, true to form, the British and French governments do not accept the decision of Egypt to nationalize the canal. And what they do, and they do not clear this decision well with the United States, who is by now the dominant power in the West. What they do, they collude with the Israeli government to attack Egypt and retake the Suez Canal. It's Nasser's role in the Suez War of 1956 that truly establishes his charismatic role as a popular leader, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world and actually throughout the developing world. The reason this episode cements Nasser's charismatic position and legitimacy is the expected British-French reaction to his decision to nationalize, as is evidenced in this contemporary news clip of the period.
At the Portsmouth Naval Base, Britain prepares for the worst in the Suez crisis. Part of her mothball fleet, idle since World War II, is hastily made ready for action. President Nasser continues to defy the Western powers on his seizure of the canal and seeks the support of Russia and the Arab League countries.
The amphibious landing of French commandos at Port Fouad, east of the Suez Canal, proceeds as a jet bombing just about paralyzes the Egyptian defenses. And scenes reminiscent of many Allied invasions during World War II are enacted in strength for the first time since the end of that conflict.
The way the 1956 Suez War unfolded was that the Israeli troops would attack through the Sinai, reach the Canal Zone, and then Anglo-French troops would almost miraculously appear to separate the two warring parties and take, almost by accident, take control of the Canal Zone and thereby neutralize the earlier nationalization. Militarily, this war was a defeat for Egypt. The Egyptian army was not able to repel either the Israelis or later the Anglo-French troops. But politically, it was an unmitigated success, because what the Anglo-French side had failed to do was to get the agreement of the United States for their little adventure. And they'd actually lied to the American president about their plans. And this is something that leads to one of the rare occasions where the United States and the Soviet Union find themselves in complete agreement, and they intercede and require the removal of Anglo-French and Israeli troops, which is then happening. And what this episode, despite the relatively feeble military performance of the Egyptian army, so what this political success results in is the firm establishment of Jamal Abdel Nasser as the undisputed leader of Egypt and of the Arab world. You see here, he's addressing a crowd in Damascus in 1960, or here he's cheered after the announcing the nationalization of the Suez Canal in Cairo in 1956. And this almost mythical, supernatural, superhero-like perception of Jamal Abdel Nasser survives even after the absolutely disastrous performance in the 1967 war. As you see in this picture, these are popular demonstrations demanding that Nasser, who resigned after this disastrous defeat, that he would take back his resignation and come back to power, which he actually did. So here we see the source of Nasser's charismatic legitimacy, if you compare to Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, whose legitimacy was based on battlefield performances. Nasser's is more based on the psychological perception of him as a hero rather than an actual military prowess. Let's now quickly look at Algeria and the other countries under consideration. We saw that France considered Algeria to be part of its mainland. Here we have a contemporary map from the period that shows Algeria as an integral part of France. So it refused to countenance any suggestion of independence for Algeria. And we already mentioned that all of the North African countries supplied France with very considerable numbers of soldiers. And there was a popular expectation of reward for this loyalty, and that expectation was betrayed. There was no talk about even autonomy or devolution of authority or so, which eventually leads to the beginning of an armed resistance by the Algerians in 1954. Here in this collage you see different images of the agitation towards independence in Algeria. And as we discussed, this is an extremely bloody, violent confrontation, something very well expressed in this contemporary newsreel that I'm going to show you.
France throws the bulk of its military manpower into the Algerian rebellion, which daily assumes the proportions of total war. Flying columns fan out through the country, which on all sides has become a target for hit-and-run attacks by native guerrillas. And rounding up guerrillas has kept almost 400,000 of France's best troops pinned down. Chief sufferers in the raids have been the outlying farm communities, many of which have been razed by fire and their operators slaughtered. Whole factories have been put to the torch, even as France builds up its military establishment to peak strength. Armed depots now dot the whole Algerian landscape as French forces are deployed to provide swift striking power in a war of attrition whose end is not in sight.
as was expressed in this newsreel, France is throwing the entire military might at its disposal into the Algerian conflict. And the degree of violence and polarization that exists is now threatening to actually unravel the peace and order, not only in Algeria, but also in mainland France. You see here, as I already mentioned earlier on, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète under General Massou, who is depicted here in this contemporary drawing, they actually tried to stage a coup d'etat in France. And you see here a demonstration in Algiers, barricades being built in Algiers, Vive Massou, as it says on the banner. So there's a great deal of popular support for the mutineers and putschists. And at this point in the conflict, it's also important to remember that the conflict was not located or was not limited to Algeria, but was now spreading to the other French colonial possessions in Morocco and Tunisia, as expressed in this contemporary newsreel.
North Africa is aflame with civil war, which from day to day grows in intensity. The tide of battle shifts from Algeria to Morocco almost hourly, as completely aroused nationalist natives take on the full military might of France. Hit-and-run raids leave villages in flames, often with most of their inhabitants massacred. All roads are under guard and barricaded, passable only to the French military. Even as talks between Arab leaders and the French take place, the unbridled fury of the guerrilla warfare continues. With 2.5 divisions deployed and French reservists called up, the rebels continue to fight, but at a cost. Already 1,700 are dead. Not even hospitals are spared in the savage struggle. As for the non-combatants, they, as always, are the pawns in a rebellion whose seeds are sown deeply.
And it is this threat to the integrity of France itself that ultimately motivates the return of de Gaulle into French politics and his recognition that the war in Algeria has to end, which then ultimately leads to the Evian Accords that we already discussed last time, and the recognition by France of Algerian independence. The Algerian Republic is left-leaning. It orients itself away from the Western powers, not surprising perhaps given its history, and leans towards the Eastern Bloc. But like the Egyptian free officers, who also lean towards the East, the Algerian revolutionaries, or National Liberation Movement, does not share a very clear ideological outlook on how it wants to transform Algerian state and society. So yes, it is leaning towards the East, but it's not a socialist movement. It does not have this coherent ideological vision that we identified so powerfully in Turkey and Mustafa Kemal. And what this lack of ideological or strategic vision results in is this all too familiar pattern of a descent of this popular movement into the one party and often one family dictatorships that we see. So here we see King Mohammed V, just the year 1957, the year after independence, who is continuing with his autocratic dynasty. But at the very least, in the Moroccan case, the royal family stands for stability and continuity through the person of the monarch. So there are some redeeming features of his autocratic and highly repressive rule. And let's not forget that it begins a period of strong legal reform. But it's an extremely autocratic and personalized form of government. But as we see here in the Algerian case, the situation is much starker. Here you see a picture of the FLN leaders at the beginning of the national liberation struggle. And in 62, when Algeria becomes independent, you see Ben Bella, who had been imprisoned by the French, assumes the presidency, and he holds that post until 65. But there's no constitutional transmission of power. He's deposed by his old friend Boumedienne and placed under house arrest for the next 15 years. When in 1980 he's allowed to leave the country into exile. So Boumedienne then establishes this personalized family dictatorship in Algeria. And we see the same process in Tunisia. He is Habib Bourguiba giving a speech in the city of Bizerte. And he's the first president after the country assumes independence in 56. And he holds that post until 87, when he's suffering from dementia. He's deposed by Ben Ali, whom some of you might recall from the news reporting of the Arab Spring recently, when he was in turn put out of power by popular movements. The story to remember here is that all of these countries do not establish functioning political systems that allow for a constitutional process of democratic or any other form of stable change. So it's a personalized form of autocracy that is now developing in the post-independence period. We see a similar process now unfolding in Libya. If you recall, from 1912, Libya comes under the control of Italy. And Italy continues its colonial administration of the territory right up to World War II, when, as a result of the changing fates of war, the Italian troops are displaced by British troops. So Britain assumes control in Libya from 1943 till 1951, and then establishes a pliant monarchy to ensure its interests in the year following independence that is granted in 51. And so we have from 1951 till 69 a period of the Libyan monarchy, which is not dissimilar to the Egyptian case. It's a highly illegitimate form of government. There's no real local roots to this claim to power, apart from being put in place by the British colonial masters. But given what comes after, this period is actually remembered among many Libyans as a period of relative stability and prosperity. So there's a certain nostalgia for this period, which can only be explained by the lunacy of what comes now, because we see in 69 this familiar pattern of a putsch. You know, you have the Colonel Gaddafi and his friends putsch against the king, replace him, and establish an, again, left-leaning form of government oriented towards and trying to get patronage from the Eastern Bloc, but again, not being a socialist movement as such. And what Gaddafi then tries to do to bolster his own claim to power is he tries to put down his vision of government in the famous Green Book, the first part of which reads as the solution to the problem of democracy, the authority of the people, and reflected also in the change of the denomination of the Libyan state to the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, which is some invented word that does not want to acknowledge republic, but comes up with a new word, seemingly embodying what the Colonel Gaddafi thought as the proper way of having an Arab response to modern government. What the Gaddafi legacy leaves in Libya is a very shallow state, a very shallow institutional structure, and it's perhaps best remembered for some of the publicity stunts that he has done. We see in this picture, for example, something that he liked to do was to pitch his tent in some of the international capitals that he visited. Here we see his tent in the Russian capital, Moscow, with President Putin next to him, because the colonel could not stay in a hotel. And as all of you know, his son liked to actually stay in hotels and beat up servants in Swiss hotel rooms, which you all might remember. The Libyan case is also interesting because it represents an extreme case of a rentier economy. A government such as that of Colonel Gaddafi would be inconceivable if he had not been the recipient of an extremely generous revenue stream for which he had to put zero input in. There's no administrative capacity or productive capacity necessary on behalf of the Libyan state to be to get hold of these revenues. And this aspect of the rentier economy feeding an autocratic, or in the Libyan case, even lunatic form of government, we will discuss in the next week when we talk about the Gulf states that are also very clear examples of rentier economies. In the next video, however, we will look at the modernization and reform movements that are now taking place in the post-independent period.